sort of how that's assessed, and the other related impact narrowly that you were talking about is sort of the framing, how that's presented. And I think another, I would actually separate those as two separate, they're related in that case, but I see framing as a really important issue and priority, both from the science and the policy perspective, more broadly. And as an example that was brought up by the panel, this conflict, or this meeting that had voters and aquaculture, and one is delivering a non-native species that's impacting another. I think an interesting feature is that each of those communities have a very strong environmental ethic. And in the long term, they're interested in sustaining, talk to a boating community, they're enjoying the environment, or they're fishing. Or, in the case of aquaculture, they're relying on the environment for their business. In the long term, they have an environmental ethic and really the same goal. But the way the issue is framed is all important. And I've interacted with some social scientists on different projects, one having to do with bait. And bait's collected in the United States and Maine and shipped all over the country and all over the world, in fact, with a lot of associated species with it. The people who do that in Maine, they're running a business, they have a long-term interest in the environment. The people that buy the bait are fishermen, and they have a strong environmental ethic. If you tell them this is a problem, they hear what you're saying, but they don't, it's not framed properly so that they sort of align that with what their environmental ethic and their long-term interest is. And so I think there's a very important aspect of framing and a distinction between short-term and long-term goals. And the way I would maybe put that as a priority is framing, yes, but maybe that leads to some sort of an analysis from a social marketing point of view. The social science that really understands what the sort of core ethics and values are that resonate with people. And I would contend or submit that invasions conflict with a lot of those ethics. It's just not framed in a way that the uptake is really very effective.
Greg, I think you're absolutely correct. If I could just comment and reflect on that a little bit, I think a lot of what you're saying with the framing comes back to a lot of the infrastructure, certainly we have in Canada, around research and analysis and policy. When you think about CAISN as an example, and I'm a huge fan of CAISN and other networks like CAISN, because it tries to be mission-oriented, it brings together a critical mass of the right skills and expertise in the science community to answer certain targeted questions, and I think that's fantastic. Where I think we might want to go with that as a next step to try and address some of the issues you have raised is to develop multidisciplinary type CAISNs. Maybe not CAISN, maybe something under another name, because like the stovepipes we see in governments as an example, just the way the structures are, we see similar types of stovepipes in the academic world, in the thinking world, where the science community thinks science, the social science community thinks social science, the businessy marketing community thinks along those lines. And it's rare that those communities really come together around an issue in a multidisciplinary way. But I think the issues we're discussing today are indeed multidisciplinary, where you need the natural science, you need the social science, and then you need the business and the marketing angle to come in and really do the end run on that. But I'm really looking forward to seeing some sort of construct that would allow those schools of thought to come together toward that mission type of end. Because I think that's how you're going to be able to tackle your framing question.
Other thoughts from the audience? Sounds like you're setting up the next CAISN 3.
It'll be in New Zealand.
A little bit afraid here because it's going to make me sound like I think I know more than I do. When discussing the need to shift towards an impact-based focus, how well do you think that needs to, because it's the economic information, right? right? But the impact is long after the invasion has established. So if you attempt to, the species that people are interested in, okay, assess the impacts, tell me what the economic damage is, and then we can assess whether we need to control it or not. Those are the species that have already been identified as established following the invasion. So what I'm trying to get at is, where do you get a balance between, like with biosecurity, you're just concerned with prevent everything that comes in, and a balance between impact assessment? Do you think one needs more than the other, or should they both be sort of equal?
Well, first of all, definitional biosecurity is the system. It covers everything from prevention through to control and to some extent mitigation and management. I'm not advocating a shift to an impact focus. The reality is we have an impact focus when it comes to policy, because we are forced to identify why we should pay attention and allocate funding to this arena. Now, we've persisted for quite some time with poster children that the demonstrable impact of management, of having to manage those things, almost invariably on the back of economic or human health interests, means that we've been able to get this far. But there's a desire for us to be able to manage across the environmental, economic, social, and cultural elements of that interest. And I think Craig's very correct. The framing of how we present that information in terms of what the potential for consequence will be is critical. It's not after they've been introduced that we should be trying to frame that argument. It's in anticipation of a species that we are concerned with. So as we move towards the process of risk assessment to try and help us understand what are the next potential threats, we need to be in a state space that we can say, we believe that these are the consequences. If we're going to do risk assessment, we have to have that anyway, because risk is the likelihood and the impact. So it's really just an element that feeds into the biosecurity framework. The difficulty is we don't have that. We currently have a lot of other information and we make a lot of assumptions. If you look at some of the economic risk assessments or economic impact assessments that have occurred, they've got these wonderfully high variable estimates. I think one of the harmful algal bloom ones went from, we estimate it's going to cost $1 million to about 25 billion. Well, that didn't help, right? So we really have to kind of hone our ability to understand what those impacts are likely to be. And as I said, I think the impact is really interesting. I can tell you that this Ascidian is going to decimate the fowling community. But if there's no value set that actually has any relevance to that, other than the fact that as a researcher I really value the native fowling community, then that's not going to have any resonance. So I think we need to have some understanding of that. We need to populate that aspect of how we manage the system.
I can just sort of continue on that and pick up on your point about, and Dylan as well, but part of it is then you kind of deliver it, right? It's the communication at the end. And I think one of the challenges sometimes is who the audience is that the communication is intended for, because the message is different, or the considerations are different depending on who you're trying to partner to bring on board as a decision maker to influence, as a citizen to get engaged in supporting work or hands-on. And so I think part of that is also so the message changes with the audience, and the audience changes with the with your intention of communicating. So it's easy in very broad terms to think about communicating the importance of addressing the threat of invasives, but in a really at a very conceptual kind of level, that's it's hard to make that a concrete and meaningful message. So you talked about sort of poster children, but that only really resonates with people who are directly affected by that particular species. So it's almost, it's how you scope and scale and tailor your message, and it comes down, I think, back to, it came up a little bit this morning as well, which is setting priorities. So, and those priorities, you may have some very broad common priorities at a national level, that there can be some kind of common effort in figuring, at least at a national level, are there one or two things that, where there's common priorities, common need that we can collectively work on. In addition to that, inevitably there will be kind of sectoral or regional or other kind of priorities where your audience might be slightly different or the focus different. So I think it's figuring out what that right balance is, and where maybe in a national level conversation, I'm a bit preoccupied with, where can, from the federal side, we be kind of helping with those, that national dialogue versus the more targeted work that also needs to happen.
Okay, you're actually involved in putting through a regulatory initiative. And did you use any of the CAISN products for your regulatory impact analysis?
For the AIS regulation? Currently the species that will be listed initially are Asian carp, zebra, and quagga mussels, and then the existing list in Ontario and Manitoba. But for Asian carp, zebra, and quagga mussels, the risk assessment work that was done, it was used as the biological rationale and their socioeconomic work that we gathered from the western provinces on the zebra and quagga mussels. And going forward, we'll be using those kind of risk assessment work. I'm not sure exactly if there's been any specific CAISN research projects that were used, but they were probably, unless they were referenced as part of the risk assessment or the biological synopsis and things of the individual species.
And in the last question there, it talks about what would be scientific priorities if you needed them for impact assessment. Can you address that?
Well, in addition to risk assessments on specific species, I think pathway risk assessment is an important area, but also something that's been mentioned a lot by provinces lately is we have a lot of science that's identifying risks. The regulation will put some tools in to address those risks, but for rapid response, for example, the use of products to deleterious substances, drugs, and pesticides to address aquatic invasive species, they have to go through a process of risk assessment, but usually it's the manufacturer who acts as the proponent to supply that information to Health Canada, the Pest Management Regulatory Agency. And there's a bit of a problem there because private manufacturers don't really have an impetus to do that for a product that might be used in only small amounts and used for invasive species control, as opposed to a money-making, product that would be used in an aquaculture facility or something like that. So that's one area where if their PMRA has indicated, the more scientific knowledge there is on a specific product, that information can be used by them to facilitate the registration process, especially the emergency registration process, so we could act quickly. So that's one area, is the effectiveness of rapid response activities, and the impact of those kinds of substances is an area that we've heard is of growing concern, especially from provinces.
Would you like to take note?
Yes.
I have a question related to that. For Tracy, do the risk assessments take consideration of climate change impacts on invasive species into account?
I'm going to throw this one to Becky.
They haven't, but they would.
And-
That isn't a question has been asked of us.
And that has been identified as knowledge gaps in the current risk assessments, like the recent screening level risk assessments, identify climate change as a knowledge gap, and that these risk assessments could be rerun using climate change scenarios. Lab.
Nick, I'm struck by Colin's request for numbers, because I think that's the wrong path, to be honest. I think in parallel with the impact, number one, I think those numbers, every time I see a number go on the screen there, I go, give me the calculation on that one. Because, I mean, I know that there were some, in the early zebra mussel days, that were calculated on cocktail napkins, and assumed complete collapses of certain fisheries that said that it never happened. And I don't think that, and I remember seeing David Kuhnenthal present something where he valued songbirds at $25 each or something like that, and the cats eating the songbird, and there are number of cats in the United States, and it becomes almost a farce in some sense of trying to get a number, because we understand economics and dollars can be convincing, and I harken back to the environmental movement, which I can see a parallel, and Silent Spring didn't start off with, it's cost Americans, $7 billion in lost songbirds calling in the field. It's much more visceral, and I'd rather go back to poor Chad missing his favorite tunicate, because I think it teaches people to appreciate just the beauty of nature and not have to try and put a dollar and a cent on it. And I understand that people have all those needs to do it, but I think it's a sad path to it.
I've often thought that the problem starts in kindergarten, where we teach the children to count before we teach them ecology, right? Because that's when they start valuing things.
But like the tourism industry, this is not an invasive species. Crown of thorns we're about to see the third crown of thorns outbreak. It's insidious, and it's going to sweep down the reef. A reef that's been critically affected by land-based runoff and eutrophication within the coastal lagoon, and then subsequently a suite of warming events and a couple of cyclones that have actually just ripped down the reef. So you've got this damaged ecosystem that over the last 30, 40 years is at half the coral cover that it was 30 or 40 years ago. And now we're going to see a crown of thorns outbreak. And so there's a pretty strong desire to treat this as an invasive pest, right? The tourism industry is critically arguing, and successfully arguing with the government, that they wish to protect the value of the reef, economic value for them, but they're using aesthetic value as the argument. This isn't attractive. This is what people are willing to pay. This is how, and so, while I don't necessarily agree with the approach that they're taking, because it is monetizing everything, it's working. They're getting support. It is a visceral response because people care about the reef.
And I can agree with you that, yes, getting more tourists to come and spend more dollars locally is good, and whether it's $50 or $50 million, I mean, but when we put these doom and gloom numbers up there, I think that we're setting ourselves, we're potentially setting ourselves up for a fall, because someone's going to say, show me the numbers. And I think, and again, I would argue, I don't know who did it here, but I saw some numbers up there that were pretty frightening, and I would argue that they're probably baseless. No, I'm sure. I would say it's this rumor game where you say 5 billion or 5 million, 50, and it just goes around, and someone puts it on the screen, and you take it off a website, and suddenly, $50 billion, right? Isn't that what Kuhnenthal bio-sign paper was?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'm sure that's $5 trillion now. It's been just transformed. It just, I mean, the only really good study I saw of this was zebra mussel. Chuck O'Neill. Does anyone know Chuck O'Neill here? Yeah, a couple people. Went out and actually asked a bunch of power plants how much they actually spent on this, and he came up with, I think, $50 million for zebra mussel. He published a small note or something, and that was the only real calculation, and most of that was putting in preventive stuff. It wasn't really the impact. It was mostly people preparing for the impact. And again, I don't follow this stuff. It's not my business, but that's what I saw. There, I thought so. It's not $3 billion like somebody calculated on cocktail napkin back in those good days. But so yeah, I think that the economic argument can be there, but I don't think quantifying it without a good basis is very, very...
Well, finding out how much Carolina Biological Supply is going to charge you for a tunicate is probably not the best way to do it.
Okay, any last thoughts from the audience? Any last thoughts from the panel?
to make a point that human beings themselves are big vector. And human activities is always the cause of moving of alien species. And that behavior has to be changed. And we would like to know the scientists' knowledge, how those people's awareness can be improved. More evidences of invasions, or what type of recognition by humans about all those alien species. Our convention is really keen to know how to change human behavior. So if you have any good cases or ideas, please feel free to contact CBD, because we would like to collect best practices, and those communications that I heard today was all very valuable, and I was very impressed that Canadian scientists are really active and knowing the issue. So why Secretariat in Montreal cannot collaborate with Canadian scientists? I would love to hear your suggestions and innovative ideas. Yes, please.
Well, just before I wrap up, I just want to address your comment, and it's sort of shameless self-promotion, but I have a postdoc who's just coming out with a paper on human behavior as it relates to baitfish release. And we did a survey of 5,000 anglers in Ontario and Michigan, and then he did a card analysis to figure out whether or not you can predict the behavior of any given angler. And as it turns out, 50% of the anglers never release their bait because they know it's bad. 35% release their bait, but they don't know it's bad, and probably would not release it if they knew it was bad. But then there's this 15% of what we call bad actors, that you cannot predict their behavior, but they know it's bad, but they're releasing it anyways. And the thing that we conclude from that is, the only reason we actually need regulations is for those 15% that are the bad actors. And we have to figure out how to get to those 15%. And when we're talking about communicating the message to the public, and we have to figure out how to resonate, make that message resonate with the public. Perhaps this type of study is one way where we can, that will help us hone that message and focus that message on the bad actors in this. So just on that note, the bad acting note, you've all been excellent actors. You've hung in to the end. You were buoyed up by some caffeine at the break. The discussion has been fantastic. I really appreciate the panelists' participation at the end of the long day. Thank you for sticking around. I thought the presentations were excellent today, and I think overall I'm hoping that our HQP and our researchers have a better understanding of the Canadian AIS policy landscape. And also I think that perhaps we've even helped the policy people from the different groups become more aware of what's happening in each other's groups. So let's give a round of thanks to the panel and the speakers. And I will call the workshop to a close, and if you're traveling, safe travels.
Thanks,